So out of that thought, the thought that we should treat others as ends in themselves, comes what's now very common in our discussion of ethics and politics, all the talk about kind of rights and autonomy. What does autonomy mean? Autonomy just means something like autonomos, the ability to set a nomos, a law, for your autos, yourself. So if someone is autonomous, they're a rational being who is able to set an end or a law, a principle for themselves. So when we judge that something else is autonomous in that way, we then regard them as rational ends in themselves that can't be treated merely as means. We have to be consistent. We want to be treated as ends in ourselves, as autonomous beings, because we have the ability to set ends and judge what's right or wrong to do. And so we should confer the same privilege on other beings whom we judge to be autonomous in the same way. So we can't then just run roughshod over their autonomy and take away their right to legislate for themselves what they are going to do. And so that's why you get all the talk about rights, even in the kind of American Bill of Rights that comes out of the same exact period, the Enlightenment. We have a right to freedom of speech, a right to freedom of religious expression, a right to have a gun, a right to property, and so forth. Don't treat others who are rational and autonomous as mere means to your ends. You have to respect their autonomous ability to set ends for themselves. So Kantian ethics goes from this kind of very abstract idea that we ought to be consistent to a much more substantive claim that we have to treat other rational beings in a certain kind of way as autonomous, self-legislating beings who have a kind of moral standing and moral dignity. Now, about the animals, you'll see in the lectures on ethics reading that we give you that Kant doesn't think that animals are rational in the right sort of way. So they're not autonomous. They don't set laws for themselves. They don't follow principles. They don't reflect on what they're doing and think, okay, this is the right thing to do. And so we can, he says, treat them as mere means to our ends. We don't have to respect them or confer rights upon them in the way that we do things that are persons. That doesn't mean, however, that Kant thinks we can just do anything to animals. Some people think that Kant says that, and there are places where it looks like he's pretty rough on the animals. You can just treat them as food or whatever else you want to do with them. But in fact, as you see in these snippets from the lectures, he's concerned about animals in a kind of indirect way. So he says we don't have any of these direct duties to animals the way that we do to persons, but we do have indirect duties. So what does that mean? An indirect duty is a duty that we have to something because we have a duty to something else. So we get to a duty to the animal by way of the duty that we have to some other thing, the direct duty that we have to some person. So what are the persons in question? Well, consider your neighbor. He owns a horse and he's got a pet dog, and he loves these animals, and they also work for him, or at least the horse does, and helps him farm and so forth. To go over and steal the horse or shoot the horse or torture the dog or eat the dog would be to disrespect not the dog and not the horse, but rather the guy, the person, the farmer, your neighbor. And that guy is deserving of respect. He has certain rights to property, rights to have his belongings treated in a certain way, and you'll have violated his rights and your direct duty to him, and therefore kind of violated what Kant will call an indirect duty to these animals by treating them in that way. So he kind of makes a distinction then between animals that are close enough attached to various persons, various rational beings, that they inherit a kind of indirect duty. You see that he says, you know, if they've worked for us, if they've helped us produce sustenance and food, if they've been our companion animals, if they've been in some way involved in service with us, kind of living with our families as pets, then they inherit a kind of indirect moral status. We can't just treat them as mere means to whatever ends we have. We need to consider what the people involved will feel and think and respect their autonomous decisions with respect to these animals. So it's not a really high-level view of animals. It's still saying, you know, they don't have moral standing. They're just kind of beings that go for their top inclination. They don't reflect, they're not autonomous, they don't have rights, but they do have these indirect, in a way, we have these indirect duties to them that go by way of our duties to other rational beings. And that's going to cover a lot of animals and protect them from certain kinds of abuses. Another way in which Kant thinks we have an indirect duty to animals is that he thinks we can see in them certain kinds of similarities to persons, to, in particular, human persons. So he recognizes that we are also animals, though he thinks that we are rational animals, as most Western philosophers will agree. Rationality is what sets us apart and gives us autonomy and these rights and these duties and moral standing and so forth. But insofar as animals are sentient creatures who have feelings and inclinations, they seem able to be in pain, they seem to be able to be in pleasure, they seem to be able to be happy in some low-level way. Kant thinks there's a kind of worry about people who would just abuse animals, kick them around, starve them, neglect them altogether. And the worry, again, is indirect. It's not because doing that is bad and the animal has a right not to be treated that way. It's because doing that is bad in the sense that it gets us used to treating things that are significantly like us in a way that's abusive. We, as human persons, deserve to be treated well and respected, but we're also animals, and we share a lot of the animal's traits. So if we get used to treating animals in a really negligent, abusive way, we might then move over to treating human animals, rational animals, in that way. So Kant thinks there's like a slippery slope here, and that you have to be really careful in the way you treat animals because it might desensitize you in a certain way and lead you to treat rational animals in a way that would then be morally abhorrent. So another sense in which we have an indirect duty to non-human animals.